So we have this variety within developing Asia. So many of these global features are then played out within our region. And of course, the big feature that was played out first in the 1990s was the feminization of export-oriented production. That is to say, in the period when, especially in developing Asia, there was this massive growth of manufactured exports. Really, the period from the mid-80s to the late 90s, there was a very large increase in the exports of manufactured goods from developing countries. And a large part of the employment in these export-oriented activities was women. Okay? So this was called the feminization of export-oriented production. On average, anything between 70 to 80% of the people employed in export manufacturing were women. Okay? Whether you're looking at the garment factories or the factories that made all those electronic goods or the factories that made the white goods, across the board, they were dominantly women. And of course, they were women, in fact, of a certain age group, between the ages of 18 and 35. In the Philippines, there was a survey that tried to look at older women. They could not find, in Metro Manila, they could not find a single woman above the age of 35 working in an export-oriented factory. Everybody was between the ages of 18 and 35. Across the board, you find this in all the major export-oriented factories, that you had young women working for relatively brief periods. And there's a reason for this. There's a reason for why disproportionately the employers preferred these young women. One is because, many of these activities are activities that have relatively short periods of learning. That is to say, you can pick up the trade quite easily. You can pick up the task that you have to perform quite easily. It's repetitive, it requires a lot of detail, it requires eye-hand coordination. That's very important. A lot of men think women don't have it, right? This whole attitude to women drivers, oh, they're hopeless, etc., because we apparently don't have eye-hand coordination. By the way, we do, okay? We have eye-hand coordination, and that's what makes us really good at this kind of detailed, specific work, especially in a lot of these IT hardware industries, in DRAM, in chips, and so on and so forth, repetitive. But because it is this fairly detailed and repetitive work, it's high burnout. After about 5 or 6 years, you don't get better, you get worse. You're exhausted. And really, it's one of those industries where you can't really keep doing this for more than a maximum of 8 years. It's almost impossible not just because you are sick and tired of doing the same thing, but because it becomes difficult after a point. In other words, the peak working period, now it's quite clear, for this kind of activity is between 6 and 8 years. Now think of it, you get a young woman, you can use the life cycle to make them work for that long. In other words, you get a young woman who really wants to earn money before she gets married and starts having babies. And you don't even have to throw them out. They want to go off and get married. And then when they're having the babies, they don't have the time and the energy, and they can't do this anyway for a while. And by the time they want to come back, it's too late, they're too old, okay? So you can use the life cycle as a way of getting these people. We all know that women have a lower, what we economists call it a lower reservation wage, the wage that you expect. Women workers tend to have a lower reservation wage. Why? Because we don't see ourselves as the primary earners. When we are young women, we see that we are going to be, working for a short time before, and later when we're married, we see ourselves as contributing to the family income, not as the sole earner, not as the primary earner even, the one who's responsible for making sure that everybody else survives. Very rarely are women forced into that situation. Many of them are, okay? But mostly the self-perception is still that they will be adding to family incomes rather than being the sole earner. That gives us a lower reservation wage. So you can have big gender gaps. This is actually an issue which is relevant for Estonia as well. But gender gaps in East Asia were very high. I think in Estonia you have a very high gender gap. I think the average female wage is only 62% of the male wage. But in the countries I'm talking about, in South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on, it was 55%. In some cases as low as 50%. Very, very high gender gap. The women were getting half the male wage. So cheaper, less likely to go on strike. I don't even have to tell you all of that, right? Everybody knows women don't mobilize, organize, and then go demanding better conditions, etc. Very easy to push around so that you can have all kinds of outrageous rules, very few, they're called bio breaks, where you can go and use the toilet. Very few, very short lunch hours, and so on and so forth. It's much easier to actually bring women workers into this kind of activity because it gives the employers huge flexibility. They can throw people out because mostly they're not unionized. So if the demand for their orders comes down, they can actually reduce the employment and say, well, come back again next year or come back in 6 months without any issues, without any problems. They can use the life cycle to keep replacing workers and keep them at their most productive phase. So for all these reasons, women were the preferred choice of workers, as workers in these export-oriented industries in Asia. And as I said, they dominated these industries. This is a period, therefore, in the mid to late 90s when everybody was talking about the feminization of export-oriented employment. But economists, we are notoriously behind. We're always late in catching trends. And precisely at the point when we were having the most conferences where everyone was presenting research papers about these trends, that was when that phase was over already. Already from the mid-1990s, really from 95, 96 onwards, there was less and less employment of women in the export-oriented production. Okay? So the trend that we were all busy identifying and then explaining, that trend was on the decline. It was losing its impetus by the late 1990s, even before the Southeast Asian crisis. So when you look at it, you're looking at the share of female employment. It goes up, 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 and it hits about 80%. Then it starts coming down. And both absolute and relative shares of women in manufacturing employment both start coming down from the mid-90s onwards, before the crisis in East Asia. Something weird going on. What was going on? Well, it turns out that the very features that made women attractive and caused a huge increase in female employment. In some of these countries, we're talking about a doubling of women's workforce participation in just 10 years. It goes from 15, 20% to 45, 50%, in some cases to as much as 65, 70% of the women get involved in these activities, and involved in paid work. So that's a huge shift. And then suddenly there's another shift where that's kind of thrown out again. What was going on? Well, when you got that big increase in women working in export-oriented employment, this is actually, it gives you a broader social kind of shift as well. Because there are more women working in paid work. I have to tell you, women are always working. Okay, this whole idea that women are not working is crazy. Women are always working. A lot of the work is unpaid. Okay, but the shift from unpaid to paid work gives a greater awareness of the fact that women are working, and then it gives rise to demands for better conditions for work. And sometimes it's because there's some very high-profile disaster or accident. In Thailand, there was a factory fire where everybody died because the doors are locked except for when the bio break happens, and that created a big stink, and then there was a move to regulate the conditions of these factories and so on. In South Korea, there was a demand for actually improving the gender gap, and there was legislation that tried to raise the minimum wages for women to reduce the gender gap. Elsewhere, other countries found, I think this is true in Estonia as well, that women were not having babies because there was just too much work. In this period in your prime, you were busy working, and there was no assistance in other parts of your life. You weren't getting childcare facilities, you weren't getting creches, etc., etc. So less and less babies. So in the move to encourage more babies, women were given better conditions of work and so on. Now, all these things, which are part of the increase in women's paid workforce participation, all of these meant that women became more expensive. The whole point of having these women is that they were really cheap and you didn't have to give them any protection, any facilities, anything. But if you have to start giving them protection the same way you were giving the male workers protection, then it's not so much fun, right? So a lot of employers then started looking for ways of not just employing less female labor, but employing less labor altogether. You have more and more and more mechanized techniques in export-oriented employment, a massive reduction in the labor requirement of this export-oriented production, and a reduction of the paid female workforce.